I was intrigued to participate and meet with y'all because of the question that you posed. I think it was, should wolves be allowed? And I thought, well, for heaven's sakes, of course. Indeed, I found the question to be arrogant, assuming that we have the right to decide what should or shouldn't be. If Yellowstone has great value, you guys can decide on your own, but having had a chance to work there and think about wild places and wild things for almost 40 years now, I think the greatest gift Yellowstone gave us is its power to birth ideas. It birthed the idea of national parks all over the world. It was very much involved in giving rise to this notion of light-handed management. It was called natural regulation, which was a poor choice of words. Nothing that humans do is any more unnatural than what an elk might do. We're a carbon-based organism too. But we certainly can say the hand of man can be applied lightly or heavily. In cornfields in Illinois, the hand is applied very heavily. But in Yellowstone, for many years, they've tried to apply it lightly, to see what nature would do on its own, for the most part. And some people don't like what nature does on its own. There was for many years in Yellowstone, for example, a culling program involving elk, based on the notion of, well, for heaven's sakes, there's too many elk. If we don't do something, they will die horrific deaths of starvation. Yeah. Nature doesn't assign value to death. It's not good or to die one way and bad to die another. You just live and you die. We struggle with the black and white world of nature sometimes, so we stepped in with a heavy-handed culling program. And then the park said, no, that's not right, that's not right. In the 60s, they put forward the notion of natural regulation and backed away and let the elk do what the elk's going to do. And well, of course, in the absence of mortality forces operating on the elk population, it grew. And by the time the Yellowstone Wolf Project began, the elk population was a problem in the minds of most folks. Entirely too big, spilling north out of the park across places like Gardner, Montana, and further north, impacting private lands. Interestingly enough, now people complain that the gray wolves have exerted too much predatory pressure and the elk herd is entirely too small. And it's as though you can never satisfy all the people all the time. The herd's too big, the herd's too small, wolves are needed, wolves are a problem, and back and forth you go. But I'm glad you're going to Yellowstone. It's a wonderful place to reflect on the value of wild places and wild things. And no species is as good as gray wolves, in my estimation, at least in a terrestrial setting, for stimulating thoughtful discussions and inspiring imaginations. What I would like to do today, because you came back from Colorado, and it was teed up as a Colorado topic, I want to talk about the next great restoration opportunity, which is restoring gray wolves to western Colorado. And you might say, well, gee whiz, Mike, why is it a topic that's due, if not overdue? I've been working on gray wolves for a long time. Species was listed under the Endangered Species Act in the early 1970s. We've been poking along, trying to effect recovery ever since. That would be, let's say, I think the original listing was in 76. That's 42 years ago. We've been poking along with this, with gray wolves in the Great Lakes states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, the northern Rocky Mountains, Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, and the Mexican wolf in the southwest, the red wolf in the southeast. Why now is a serious discussion about wolves in Colorado due, if not overdue? Well, the first reason is chronic public support for the idea of gray wolves occupying the great public wildlands of western Colorado. I can show you good public opinion survey data going back to the 1990s. Several surveys have been done since then. All the surveys show the same thing: widespread majority public support for gray wolves in western Colorado. So, widespread public support. You have a very favorable pattern of land ownership. There's about 17 million acres of public land, state and federal land, in western Colorado. Western Colorado is mostly the heart and soul of the Southern Rockies ecoregion, mostly defined by public land. 17 million acres makes it bigger than the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, at least from a public lands perspective. And when you look at large carnivore conservation in this country, I'm quite confident in saying you would not have gray wolves and grizzly bears, for example, absent large tracts of public land. It's not surprising that the last gray wolves left in the continental United States after a 150, 200-year war. The last gray wolves were left in the Superior National Forest of northern Minnesota and Isle Royale National Park in Lake Superior. Not surprising that the first effort to restore a carnivore that was extinct in the wild, first effort in the history of mankind to restore a carnivore that had been declared extinct in the wild, was the Red Wolf program in the Southeast, and it was centered on the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. The second effort was centered on Great Smoky Mountains National Park and the surrounding national forests, the Pisgah, the Nantahala, and the Cherokee National Forests. Not surprising that the work in the Northern Rocky Mountains was based at Yellowstone National Park and surrounding national forests and the national forests of central Idaho. Not surprising that the work with the Mexican wolf program began in earnest in 1998 with the release in the Apache and the Gila National Forests. Public lands have been critically important for gray wolves and grizzly bears and a host of other species, but the two tough ones would be gray wolves and grizzly bears. So you've got widespread public support that's durable. You've got large tracts of federal public land. You've got a very accommodating prey population in western Colorado. We'll speak about that more in a moment. And finally, you have this continental significance that you can't find anywhere else. And that continental significance is best viewed or expressed by this slide. When you look at the Southern Rockies ecoregion, it's the area outlined in green. Mostly western Colorado, a bit in north central New Mexico, and a bit in south central Wyoming. If you can restore gray wolves to western Colorado, the Southern Rockies ecoregion, it would stand as the archstone for establishing a metapopulation of gray wolves, a population of populations, from the high Arctic to the Mexican border. There is no other place in the world where you can imagine large carnivore conservation over such a continental scale, over such a large, sweeping, inspiring landscape. If you did restore gray wolves to western Colorado, some of those animals would move north and interact with animals in Wyoming, for example. Prospects of a Wyoming wolf wandering south and interacting with one of its own kind would go way up, and similarly, animals from Colorado could move south, and Mexican wolves could move north and interact and affect this metapopulation of wolves from the high Arctic to the Mexican border. That is a achievement of notable or it would be an achievement of notable consequence. Finally, why this discussion now? When you take a look at the contemporary sensibilities of Colorado, it seems to fit the state very well. We think it's clear that this conversation is certainly due, and those are the reasons why. But you could then ask why would you sit and listen to someone like me? Why would you sit in a warm room in Bozeman, Montana, when you could be out in the sun, listen to someone like me? Well, I think there's any number of reasons why my opinion on this matter matters. I caught my first gray wolf in the upper left corner for research purposes in June of 1980, working with gray wolves in the Superior National Forest of northern Minnesota. At the time, that was the only place you could find gray wolves in the country. They were, say, 1,200 strong. I left that project, did graduate work in Alaska studying grizzly bears, but then left that work and was the first leader of the effort to restore red wolves to the southeastern United States. That's the middle picture. That little wolf there is known as 344. The radio collar has the candy stripe tape just to improve its reflectivity at night. The muzzle is so she doesn't bite us. She's not drugged. We're just using physical restraint. Her hind legs are tied up. She was the first red wolf born in the wild in many, many decades. From there, I had the high honor of serving as the first leader of the effort to restore gray wolves to Yellowstone National Park. That's my dear friend and colleague at the time, Doug Smith. Doug has since led that project since I left about 20 years ago to co-found the Turner Endangered Species Fund and Turner Biodiversity Divisions with Ted Turner back in 1997. The fund and the divisions stand as the world's most significant private effort to redress the extinction crisis. I left Yellowstone in part because I was more interested as a professional scientist in issues of rareness than issues of commonness. And much of Yellowstone's challenge on a daily basis is based on commonness. Too many bison, too many wolves, too many people. And while important issues, I was more interested in questions of why are there so few ferrets? Why are there so few Cherokee leopard frogs? And so Ted and I came together and built out the Turner Endangered Species Fund. Also, I have served in the state legislature for over the last 11 years. I will hold my state Senate seat through the end of 2020. So I've had the good fortune to see wolf restoration from a policy and legal perspective, as well as a biological perspective. And lastly, I have served on a host of wolf recovery teams. I've been on every Mexican wolf recovery team, for example, that's been convened since 1995. So I would argue on a near daily basis, now going on almost 40 years, I've had the good fortune to think about wolf recovery and conservation and research. I don't know much, but I know a little bit about wolves and wolf recovery and conservation. That's just to put in perspective a picture of a female Mexican wolf from our facility in the southeastern United States. As you probably know, historically gray wolves were very common in the continental United States. They occupied habitats from coast to coast, east to west and north to south. You could find gray wolves in forests, you could find them in deserts, you could find them in swamps, you could find them in grasslands. They were everywhere, probably the most widely distributed large carnivore in North America, maybe only eclipsed by cougars. Cougars go much further south than gray wolves do, but then of course gray wolves go much further north than cougars do. Either way, gray wolves were exceedingly common, probably millions of gray wolves in the continental United States back in the day. But of course they were subjected to very intense, determined persecution that extended at least from the late 1600s, at least the late 1700s through, mid-1950s. And eventually the effort to exterminate the gray wolf was really wildly successful, as I said earlier, by, say 1976. There were no gray wolves in this country, excepting a handful of animals, maybe 800, 900, 1,000 in the Superior National Forest and Boundary Waters canoe area of northern Minnesota. About a decade prior to that, Leopold began to pine for the wolf's return. I would argue Aldo Leopold is as close as we have to the father of wildlife management, or the father of a wildlife conservation ethic. And he said out loud in his writings, why can't we have gray wolves in wild places like Yellowstone and some of our great national forests, like you might find in western Colorado? And as you know, that whole notion by Leopold never went away, and about 50 years later we were able to achieve the end of restoring gray wolves to Yellowstone National Park and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in central Idaho with successful translocations of animals from Canada. It was clear that above all else, the Yellowstone Project made it obvious that all the gray wolf required was a willingness on our part to choose that it have a future and then make modest accommodations to ensure that future. We made a choice. So you could fairly ask, where could that choice be made again? And as we've wondered about that now, it's clear that for lots of reasons that we're going to go into soon, western Colorado is an appropriate place to consider making such a choice again. When we talk to Coloradans, we understand that they, at least for Coloradans that are willing to think about gray wolves, they immediately imagine Yellowstone as a touchstone for what the future of the western half of their state could be. So I had mentioned that Yellowstone was all about the country making a choice, first in the form of the Endangered Species Act, and then a specific choice about implementing its authorities to restore the gray wolf to Yellowstone National Park. You could fairly ask, as I said, where could you make the choice again? There's no doubt that western Colorado provides another grand, justifiable opportunity to make that same choice again. So a few years ago, I've actually been working on this since 1995, but this being the need for a serious final discussion about restoring gray wolves to the great public wildlands of western Colorado. But a couple years ago, a group of us came together and gave rise to the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, which is a coalition of conservation visionaries and non-governmental conservation organizations determined to use education to advance restoration. So, if you believe that the conversation is due, if not overdue, because of widespread public support in this wonderful assemblage of public wildlands that support a most accommodating prey population, and a state that almost certainly has socio-political sensibilities that would favor restoration, why does the idea continue to lag? Why is the idea so controversial? I think the answer, and I've thought about this a lot, but I'm convinced the answer is because of the mythical wolf. The real wolf is very difficult to see through the fog of the myth. It confuses our sense of what is right and what is wrong. Unfortunately, the myth is as strong as it is wrong. The myth would have you believe that wolves represent a threat to human safety, that wolves represent a threat to the big game industry, that wolves represent a threat to the livestock industry. None of those things are true, but the myth is oh so very powerful. I've thought about this a lot too. It's almost as though the myth would have you believe that the wolf can exercise its predatory will on a whim. And by doing so, sort of create this wake of waste and desolation and death wherever it trots. Nothing could be further from the truth. For the real wolf, life is a daily struggle to survive. Hunting is a very dangerous endeavor. It's an endeavor that is mostly characterized by failure. Good studies reveal that overwhelmingly attempts at hunting by a gray wolf end in failure. And when I make reference to what we know about gray wolf natural history, know that the evidence that I share is based on decades of research. The gray wolf is one of the most studied large mammals in the world. It's not as though we began thinking about gray wolves 18 months ago and we've published one paper in the Journal of Mammalogy. It has been extensively studied. Most attempts by a gray wolf to hunt fail. 85% of the attempts fail. Hunting is extremely dangerous. Feast or famine is the modus operandi for the gray wolf. They will go many, many days with no food whatsoever. And when things get difficult, puppies suffer most of all. As I said, hunting is a very dangerous endeavor. Injuries are common. I did a study of wolf skulls in Alaska many years ago, looked at over 200 wolf skulls. These were skulls from animals that had been killed by Alaska Department of Fish and Game to minimize predation pressure on a local caribou herd or a moose herd. So these animals had been shot. Cause of death was gunshot. So I was looking at these skulls for evidence of blunt force trauma. How often was that gray wolf kicked in the head by a moose, for example? Fully a quarter of the skulls that I looked at showed evidence of blunt force trauma. Broken nose, broken skull, broken jaw. Rolf Peterson, a good friend of mine, has studied wolves and moose on Isle Royale since 1972. That's 46 years. Every wolf he's necropsied, and of course a necropsy is just an autopsy of an animal. Every wolf he's necropsied has shown evidence of blunt force trauma. Broken leg, broken rib, broken nose. It's hard to make a living in the woods with your teeth. Why? Why do they fail so often? Why is it so dangerous? Because they're built very poorly for their lifestyle. That is not a good design for what that wolf has got to do each and every day. You know, a wolf, just like us, she gets up and goes to work every day. For a wolf, going to work means I've got to put 5 to 7 to 10, better yet, pounds of food in my belly a day in order to be healthy and capable of reproductive activity. They don't eat every day. Of course, I just said feast or famine is common, but when they do eat, boy, they can consume a great deal in a short period of time. But on average, 7 to 10 pounds a day would ensure that wolf, that she's good and healthy. That's a hard charge when you're built like that. They're small, certainly much smaller than their prey. A gray wolf in the northern Rocky Mountains on average might weigh 90 pounds. For heaven's sakes, I can find smallish white-tailed deer that weigh more than 90 pounds. So they're almost always killing something bigger than themselves. Their face is not well suited to the task at hand. That long nose doesn't help. All that long nose does is ensure that the clamping power at the tips of their canines is much reduced if compared to having a shorter nose. Imagine a cougar, for example. What a cougar can generate in terms of power at the tips of his canines is much greater than what a wolf can do. The face doesn't help. The long legs don't help in terms of grabbing anything. A gray wolf's front legs, they're not supinating. They can't reach around and grab. And that's why they're so lightly muscled. In contrast, a cougar or a black bear with supinating forearms can reach around and grab you. That's why they're so heavily muscled. Those front forelegs are heavily muscled because they're useful for grabbing. A gray wolf's feet, good for traveling. You know, there's an old Russian proverb that says a wolf is kept fed by its feet. They're good for traveling, but they're not good for much else. The nails wear down. They don't retract like a cougar's claws retract and stay good and sharp for grabbing things. Their teeth wear down and break. They're not renewable. They're not ever growing like a beaver's front incisors are ever growing. They're so poorly suited to their lifestyle. Tell me what you guys think is the sweet spot for a gray wolf. In a seasonal perspective, what would be the sweet spot for a gray wolf? The best time of the year for a gray wolf is? No, late winter. A really nasty late winter storm, boy, oh boy, they're celebrating that. Because now everything that is struggling with that late winter is just in one more way predisposed to predation. Spring, summer, fall, early winter, tough time to be a gray wolf. If it's nice outside, it is not nice for a gray wolf. They benefit mightily from the depths of winter. They're looking for any little advantage that makes up for their raft of deficits. Life is so difficult, it is noticeably short. Northern Rockies, average age for a gray wolf, 5 years, 4, 6, right in there. They certainly don't live to be 18. A lot of elk live to be old, not gray wolves. Life is so difficult, it is noticeably short. So they say, well, gee whiz, if that's the case, why is it that they were so successful? They have to have something going for themselves because they've got a lot going against them. They have two things that make up the difference and then some. They are supremely social. You can look in the Rudyard Kipling poem, Law of the Jungle, the line that says the strength of the pack is the wolf and the strength of the wolf is the pack. As individuals, kind of forgettable. As a pack, oh, now it's a different matter. And they are doggedly determined. They just keep coming. Day after day, they get up early and they go to work. And they do it again and again and again and again. It is their supreme sociality and their dogged determination that makes up for all their shortcomings. Anyway, that's the real wolf. But folks can't get their head past the mythical wolf. And I know that compels a lot of people to be exceedingly frustrated with the species, if not downright violent, and prone to cowardly acts like putting a hood over your head. And don't doubt the message they were trying to convey. in a most cowardly way. But the wolf generates this raw emotion. But I'm convinced it's mostly based on misinformation and embellishments and outright lies. And so the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project has set out for a while now to sort of correct that, to use education to advance restoration. I said at the outset that the project's aim, the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project's aim is to restore the gray wolf to Colorado, and by doing so, restore the area's natural balance. Oh, that's all well and good as far as it goes, but it begs the question, what is meant by natural balance? Well, at an important level, it's a euphemism for the original predator-prey interactions that have defined species like elk and wolves since time immemorial. And we know from reliable field studies, if gray wolves are common enough for a long enough period of time, they will kill enough stuff to change the dynamics of that setting. The process is often referred to as a trophic cascade, that gray wolves can precipitate a trophic cascade. Don't be seduced by the allure of that idea. It's not nearly as common as people would have you to believe. And it's all about wolf density and persistence. One gray wolf in Yellowstone National Park for one day does not make a whit of difference to the ecology of the area. But 100 gray wolves in place for 20 years, well, now things might change a bit. That combined with the presence of other carnivores, you notice that Dr. Smith in that video that you saw, that little 3.5-minute piece, at the very end, he says Yellowstone got a breath of fresh air with the return of wolves and other carnivores. The carnivore guild in the park is quite robust, and they're exercising predation pressure on that elk herd too. And in the presence of fewer elk, and certainly elk behaving slightly differently than they would have otherwise, certain areas of the park manifest a clear signature of a trophic cascade. So to some extent, that's what balance means. If the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project aims to restore Colorado's natural balance, it speaks to those original predator-prey interactions, but there's more to it than that. There's more to it than that. We believe balance also is a way of celebrating the original arrangement of nature. The original native species, as arranged by nature. There's balance in that arrangement, and there's wisdom in that arrangement. And we're absolutely convinced that we should not disregard or discount that wisdom, even if certain aspects, like the tension between life and death, is hard for us to get our head around. I am convinced that when you think about balance, it is exceedingly useful to point out that all of these pieces matter. The original arrangement matters. And I'm not talking about the arrangement of 65 million years ago, before the asteroid struck the planet off the coast of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula and destroyed the dinosaurs. That was an arrangement, but that's a long number. I'm talking about the arrangement of 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago. There's wisdom in that arrangement. We think there's wisdom in the tension between life and death. It would seem to me that predators and prey represent the yin and yang of nature. There's wisdom in that arrangement, and there's wisdom in keeping all the pieces. And it was Leopold who observed something to the effect that it's the first order of intelligent tinkering is to keep all the cogs and wheels. So for the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, to some extent, the notion of balance is just a keeping of cogs and wheels, doing what we can to ensure that the original arrangement is in place. Well, that's a fine sentiment as far as it goes. Right? Leopold is always fun to cite, and it's great to speak in flowery terms about the original arrangement of nature and yin and yang, and right? But there would be consequences to bringing the gray wolf back to Colorado. And they're not many, but there's a few that matter. The first is wolves and big game, wolves and livestock, wolves and human safety. And finally, then I want to speak as we focus on Colorado about this red herring argument that gray wolves will naturally recolonize the state. But first, wolves and human safety. I wish I could show you data point after data point about wolves and human safety, but I can't because they really don't exist, because wolves do not represent a threat to human safety. I can't explain why. If they knew how vulnerable we are, even with their own shortcomings, they would still be able to do just about whatever they wanted with us, but they don't. They do not represent a threat to human safety. I can understand why people have a hard time accepting that. You know, I realize gray wolves are large predators and in superficial ways are very much dog-like. And I suppose even in this small group, we've all had, or at least most of us, negative sort of nerve-rattling encounters with domestic dogs. Domestic dogs are a bigger pain in your rear end than a gray wolf ever will be, but I get the fact. And then finally, they can be some scary-looking dudes. That's a scary-looking gray wolf. I'll give you that. That's a scary-looking dude. But more often than not, they look like this old lady from the Flying D. She doesn't want anything to do with you and goes out of her way to avoid you and others of your ilk. Here are some data about wolves and human safety. Alaska Department of Fish and Game took a hard look at this issue over the course of a century's worth of data. No healthy human being killed by a wolf in North America. No dangerous interactions in the Great Lakes states, despite the fact that the states are well populated and have supported gray wolves in good numbers for quite some time. Tens of millions of visitor days recorded in the Superior National Forest and Boundary Waters Canoe Area. No negative interactions. Millions of visitor days elsewhere in national parks and wilderness areas. No incidents. Yellowstone, we're going from 95 to 2015, a 20-year period of time, 2.6 million tent camper overnight days in Yellowstone. No campers injured, despite an average of 115 wolves in 11 packs throughout the park. They simply are not, they're not a threat. Wolves are shy and avoid humans. Encounters are rare, typically involve a dog. The next big issue, wolves and livestock. And in my humble estimation, this is the biggest point of friction for encumbering the wolf's future, and it's been the biggest cause of its unfortunate past, wolves and livestock. If gray wolves are restored to western Colorado, they will kill livestock. There is no doubt about it. But not nearly as often as you would think. The data are clear. It is the atypical wolf that kills livestock. The actual magnitude of wolf livestock problems pales in comparison to what people expect. So let's look at what the data from the northern Rocky Mountains say over the last 20 years. And again, I'm not talking about a modest data set. These are rich data sets that do provide instruction. So to understand the data, here's the wolf universe in the northern Rocky Mountains. The circles represent known wolf pack territories, or known wolf packs, and, say 1,700 gray wolves. So that's the wolf universe from which the data that I'm going to show come from. 97 to 2015, an 18-year period of time, in the northern Rocky Mountains, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, there are about 6 million cattle in the three states. Wolves killed, these are annual averages, 117, and I provided the spread of the data. The low was 21 in 98, and the high was 214 in 2008. But on average, let's say 120 head of cattle are going to be killed by gray wolves in the northern Rocky Mountains. Sheep, about 1 million sheep in the three states. On average, gray wolves are going to kill about 235 sheep on an annual basis. You can see the spread of the data. Importantly, for both cattle and sheep, if they kill 117 out of 6 million, that's 0.002% of the total population. In other words, 99.998% of the cattle, 99, you gotta write this down, 99.998% of the cattle never have any problem with the gray wolf. For sheep, 99.98% of the sheep never have a problem. In contrast, the wolf population over that 18-year period of time averaged just north of 1,000. and you see the highs and lows. But on average, about 127 wolves are killed every year or in response to these livestock depredations. That represents a notable percentage of the wolf population, about 11%. Here's another interesting data point. To put all this kind of in context of how difficult it is for ranchers in the north, just pick 2010 as a normal year for the rancher in the northern Rocky Mountains. Across the three states, almost 200,000, I didn't look at sheep, just cattle, about 200,000 head of cattle die from non-predatory causes. If the gray wolves are killing an additional 117, that represents 0.06% of the 198,000. In other words, 99.94% of the cattle that die are dying for reasons wholly unrelated to gray wolves. Okay, but that's a big universe. And so maybe because of the scale of the data that I presented, maybe the landscape scale hid some important patterns. So I wanted you guys to drill down with me a little bit deeper into just Montana. So here's just Montana. About 2 million cattle in Montana on an average basis, about 450,000 sheep, and about 500 gray wolves today. And you can see all of the known wolf pack locations. Mostly it's the western quarter of Montana that is wolf country. So here's what happens on average. We're going to just look at the blue histograms. The blue's the cattle. And I'm just going to track and say this is number of animals killed on the y-axis, the year on the x-axis. I'm just going to track how many kills below a certain number for cattle. 1994, below 25, below 25, below 25, below 25, below 25, below 50, below 50, below 75, might as well be 75, below 100, below 100, below 75, below 75, below 50, below 50, right in 50. About 65. You take an average. You can do the same thing for sheep. Sheep were below 50, below 25, below 50, below 100, below 50, below 125. An odd year in 2009 drops back down below 75, below 50, below 25. Wolves killed in response. Below 25, below 50, below 75, below 1 1/4, below 150, below 150, below 1 1/4, below 75, and then on down to around 50. Those are real data that show that you're talking about a small number of cattle and sheep and a relatively biggish number of gray wolves. So now hold that thought. Here's another data slide. You've already looked at these data. Agency control. These are the reason that a gray wolf is killed and the number of gray wolves. Number of gray wolves, reason killed. We've already looked at agency control for depredations. Forget all these others. We're just going to look at legal harvest. Forget all the others. We're not really concerned about a wolf getting run over by a train, for example. So we're going to look at agency control. We just did that. And then legal harvest. And this is just Montana now, since 2009, there's been rather liberal hunting and trapping of gray wolves in Montana. Below 100, below 150, below 200, below 250, below 300. You add all these up, and here's what you end up with. Those are big numbers. Those are big numbers on top of big numbers. So if you take Montana as a whole, I just showed you the data and how it was spread, but here's what you end up with. Average numbers in Montana, about 500,000 cattle in wolf country. I said 2 million in the state, but about 500,000 in wolf country, the western quarter. About 50 are going to be killed by wolves. In the western quarter of the state, wolf country, about 165,000 sheep, about 65 killed by wolves. And in wolf country, you got 500 wolves, and about half of that population every year is killed through agency control or the recreational killing program. You can argue about the wisdom of numbers. I think there's value. They describe a pattern that says to me, in the presence of just a modicum of accommodation, coexisting with the gray wolf is not that big a deal from the perspective of wolves and livestock. So if you extend that to Colorado, Colorado statewide is about 2.85 million cattle, about 400,000 sheep. When you think of Colorado, wolf country is fundamentally everything west of I-25. East of I-25 is a lost cause for large carnivores like the gray wolf because there's too much private land. West of I-25, you have about 500,000 head of cattle and about 175,000 sheep. If we double wolf livestock interactions from Montana, so you've got, we're gonna twice Montana, so I'm 2 times 50, 100 killed by gray wolves a year out of a population of 500,000. That's 0.02%. In other words, 99.98% of the cattle in western Colorado will never have any problem with gray wolves. Same thing for sheep. Double the weight loss, the magnitude of loss, 65, that gives you 130 killed out of 175,000 is your total population, 0.07%. In other words, 99.93% of the sheep in western Colorado are not ever going to be affected by gray wolves. These data allow me to say with conviction, wolf recovery is not a threat to the livestock industry. If you're the rancher that's lost 130,000 sheep, you've got a problem. Oh, I'm sorry, 130 sheep, you've got a problem. I'll give you that. Gray wolves can be a problem for an individual producer. Those problems need to be quickly remedied. But having a problem for a producer is not a problem for the industry. Now, that's actually a simplification of wolves and livestock. If you're going to be fair, you've got to account for undetected kills. Fieldwork is always the art of estimating. There are dead sheep and dead cattle caused by gray wolves that we never know about. So if you have a compensation program, for example, to account for the loss of private property, your sheep or your cattle, it would be fair to adjust compensation upward to account for kills not ever detected. Similarly, good data from Montana show that for a ranch that suffers depredations, you just lost 3 head of sheep or cattle last night, that it's not uncommon for the herd to respond by not gaining some weight. Maybe the mother cows aren't foraging the way they should, the calves don't gain the weight they should. On average, a study of 18 ranches in Montana showed that calves from a ranch that suffered a depredation, they're 22 pounds lighter than they should be. That's real money. So similarly, you should account for, with your compensation program, weight not gained. Wolves are not a threat to human safety. Wolves are not a threat to the livestock industry. Now on to big game. There's this effort on the part of big game hunters to make the case that gray wolves are destroying big game hunting in the northern Rocky Mountains, and absolutely nothing could be further from the truth. These data are relatively easy to understand. The states on the left-hand side of the table, and then the estimated number of elk in the state, the animals harvested. These are average, many-year averages, and then deer and the harvest levels too. So just look at Montana. On average, about 147,000 elk in the state. About 24,000 are killed, about 465,000 deer, and about 100,000 deer harvested. Colorado, holy mackerel, Colorado has a very large elk population. On average, 275,000 elk. And a very large deer population of about 480,000. It's a prey population like none other. But they harvest them hard too. 48,000 elk are killed a year on average in Colorado, and about 36,000 deer. Those are many-year averages. There has been no loss of sales for big game licenses in the northern Rocky Mountains, and the numbers indicate still good numbers of elk and deer to harvest for recreational purposes. But I wanted you guys to take a more careful look at this issue because, again, this scale of my analysis may obfuscate some important patterns. You can certainly see in much of Montana without any gray wolves, there's too many elk. So for now, at least, if somebody says, I can't find a place to hunt elk in Montana, you say, bullshit. For heaven's sakes, look at the eastern half of the state. You've got so many elk management units that are above objective. Now, you may not be able to hunt your sweet spot right here in 310 outside Yellowstone Park, but all you got to do is drive an hour to 550. So there's still plenty of opportunities statewide. But then just specifically look in wolf country. And all of these sites that are cream colored below objective, and this is all wolf country, I see more red and green at or above than I do elk management units that are below. There's no way in the world you can take these data and this spatial pattern and make the argument stick that gray wolves have ruined elk hunting in the state of Montana. It's just patently untrue. It also strikes me as odd that we find far too few big game hunters that are willing to celebrate the hunt for more than the killing. You would think that some of these men and women would find a kindred connection with another great predator that has to kill in order to survive. And when you think about big game hunting, know that it is simply true that most big game hunters hunt for recreational purposes only. They are not going to go home and go hungry. Most. I'm not suggesting all hunters are affluent. I'm suggesting that the vast majority hunt for recreational purposes only. It's funny, people will say to me, well, gray wolves kill for fun. I said, no, I don't think gray wolves kill for fun, but people certainly do. Ask a hunter, how fun is it to hunt without a kill? And quite often they'll discount the value of that experience if it doesn't result in something laying on the ground dead at your feet. I find that odd, but that's my bias. Here's the easiest way to think about wolves and big game. I said earlier that a gray wolf, she wakes up every morning, she goes to work, and she's got to put 7 to 10 pounds of food in her belly a day. So let's say 10 pounds. On average, 10 pounds. That's 70 pounds a week. That's 280 pounds a month. That's the equivalent of the sustenance that she would gain from one adult cow elk. So that's 12 adult cow elk a year. Let's double it. Make it 24. Let's not double it because that makes the math confusing. Let's just call it 20. We'll bump it upwards, not quite doubling, but we'll call it 20 a year. She's got to have access to the equivalent of 20 adult cow elk a year. And let's say that there's 500 gray wolves in western Colorado. That means they're going to need access to 20,000 adult cow elk. There's 275,000 elk in that state after, I didn't show you this, after hunters have killed an average of 80,000 deer and elk. They know there's this abundance of food in western Colorado. Even if we exaggerate mightily the caloric needs of a gray wolf, you're hard-pressed to make the claim that wolves would destroy the big game hunting of western Colorado. And you might wonder why the focus on food. Because, again, the gray wolf is so heavily studied, we know from good field work, in areas where human-caused mortality is low, 85% of the variability in a wolf population from one year to the next is defined by food, prey biomass. At a certain level, gray wolves are not complicated. And there's plenty of food. I would have you believe there's a more robust, accommodating population of prey in western Colorado than for gray wolves anywhere in the world. That's the simple pitch on wolves and big game. They do not represent a threat to human safety. They do not represent a threat to the big game industry. They do not represent a threat to the livestock industry. Now, onto this red herring argument about natural recolonization. There's this persistent rumbling, no, gee whiz, gray wolves are coming to Colorado. Matter of fact, they're already here. Really. I know of 5 data points, good data points of a gray wolf wandering in the state, and either shot, run over by a car, poisoned, and I think 2 just disappeared. As I said earlier, there's that Russian proverb, a wolf is kept fed by his feet. They can certainly travel tremendous distances, but on average they don't. In the northern Rockies, the average dispersal distance, if memory serves, is 60 miles. That's not an inconsequential walk, but it's not 600 miles. But there's this notion, oh, gee whiz, just wait, Mike, they're coming. Well, I don't think they're coming, and there's no evidence that they're there in numbers that matter, and here's why we know that for sure. They do not like being alone. I said earlier, they're supremely social. They go out of their way to find each other. They will look for each other. They will smell for each other. They will vocalize. They will howl looking for each other. They do not like being alone. And they're very good at finding one another. They, as I said earlier, they are absolutely supremely social. They're good at finding each other. And once they get into good habitat, it does not take them long to become obvious and grow to notable numbers. It's just the way they do. So here's some data. The reason I keep bringing them, I gave the same talk in Colorado 2 weeks ago. And as I finished, an old fart Republican legislator, forgive my language, but bless his heart, he was an old fart Republican legislator. He stood up and he said, oh yeah, I'm going to quote Mark Twain. Mark Twain observed that figures lie and liars figure. And I wasn't quick enough on the draw, but I realized later that he actually misquoted Mr. Twain. And the quote is, figures don't lie, so liars figure. I mean, he got it asked backwards all that. I wish I had. Anyway, to make a long story short, I think the numbers matter. So here's what happens when gray wolves get into good country. So not going to worry about Wyoming and Idaho. We reintroduced gray wolves here. We're talking about animals that came out of Canada and naturally recolonized northwestern Montana. By about 1990, they started showing up in the 80s, but by about 1990, they were about 5 or 6 strong, and they were known to friends of mine at University of Montana, Bob Ream and his students, and subjected to proper field studies. 1990 to 2000, they went from about 5 to 100 in 10 years. In Oregon, 14 wolves in 2009 became 100 strong 6 years later. In Washington, 5 wolves in 2009 became 115 strong 11 years later. You can look at the Wyoming and Idaho data. We dumped wolves into the system in 95 and 96. 31 total in Yellowstone came out of Canada, and they jumped like a rocket ship too. But if you just look at the naturally occurring population in Montana, from 1990 to 2000, it went from about 5 or 6, a small number of individuals, to 100 strong in short order. It does not take them long to find certain footing in good habitat. So here's what the habitat looks like. This is one of many models. We published some of these data in 2 good journals, an article in Conservation Biology and another in Bioscience. Red is bad, low, and green is high quality. So you're sitting about right up here. Northern Rockies, that's the western Colorado, the study area that we chose for this particular model. This eastern border is defined by the Continental Divide. And you can see low habitat's not uncommon across the western U.S., but there's lots of opportunities for gray wolves to make a go in moderate and high quality habitat. This is where that color would be recruitment is about equal to adult mortality. So it's a crapshoot. You can do better here, and here you're going to struggle. And you can see western Colorado doesn't look different than much of the occupied habitat in the northern Rocky Mountains. This habitat takes into account human attributes like road density. It takes into account physical features of the landscape like topography, and it uses a metric, tasseled cap greenness, a metric that is a useful proxy for ungulate density. So it's a reasonably effective habitat model, and we've truthed it against where we know wolf packs to be in the northern Rocky Mountains. We then took that model and we said, well, let's apply it through a model that imagines animal movement as you would the flow of electricity, a current flow model. And in this model, green indicates areas where current should flow reasonably well. Gray wolves should disperse reasonably well. And then areas where the dispersal capacity would be really quite poor. And then we said, well, how well does the model fit some wide-ranging gray wolves that were outfitted with GPS collars so their track was well known? This is one animal that ended up in Northern California, or 2 that wandered through Wyoming. And for the most part, they're following where you would expect the resistance to be least. And you think, well, geez, that's not bad, Mike. Well, why can't the northern Rocky Mountains populate western Colorado? Pretty good connections through Wyoming and then Idaho and down through Utah. Well, Wyoming exercised its statutory right when gray wolves were delisted, and they did this. They did this. You see Wyoming, cross-hatched. That amounts to about 88% of the state. Throughout Wyoming, gray wolves are now listed by state law as a predatory species, which means, if you look at Montana law, you look at Wyoming law, predatory species means there is no management, which means that they can be shot anytime, day or night, in any numbers, any time of the year, and left in the field. You don't want to be a skunk in Montana, right? Predatory species. You don't want to be a coyote. Don't want to be a gray wolf in Wyoming across 88% of the state because you're listed as a predatory species. Wyoming did it on purpose because they're not the least bit interested in entertaining more than just a little bit better than the recovery criteria called for. The feds would say to Wyoming, you got to bring at least 100 wolves in 10 packs to the party, so they bumped it up a bit. Wyoming may be looking for 150 wolves in 15 packs, but they can achieve that quite easily, thank you very much, in the northwestern part of the state. Don't need to worry about gray wolves anywhere else. So we're going to call them predatory and have no management whatsoever. Here's what it does to the habitat map. Wyoming is now largely a barrier because of social intolerance. That's why what used to be, not bad habitat, now is really poor because social carrying capacity is virtually zero. So that's what it does to the habitat map. This is what it does to the connectivity map. It very much isolates Colorado. There is now, you can say, well, gee whiz, Mike, they can wander through southeastern Idaho and through northeastern Utah and still get into Colorado. That's true. Idaho, be mindful, is managing their gray wolves in a most aggressive manner too. Very liberal killing programs in Idaho. So had we applied a social tolerance filter to Idaho, some of this would go away. And Utah would love to have the same opportunity as Wyoming. And they would have almost certainly a program that would say, we're going to consider the gray wolf a predatory species too. So in the same way that we've lost Wyoming as connectivity habitat, almost certainly you're going to lose Utah too. I think there is not much of a chance that gray wolves would ever come to occupy western Colorado through natural recolonization. And even if they did, you need to note that the species still remains fully endangered under federal law in Colorado. As long as that applies, any naturally occurring wolf that shows up in Colorado cannot be managed at all. The term take is defined so prohibitively by the Endangered Species Act that there's not much you can do to an endangered animal without violating federal law. About the only thing you can get away with would be saying, Judge, I had to kill that gray wolf because my life was threatened. Other than that, your management hands are tied. So I say to Coloradans, many will say, well, wolves are coming. Wolves are coming, and they're going to get here. Mike, just be patient. I said, well, if that's the case, and you're okay with that, why in the world would you wait? If you wait, you have no management options whatsoever because they're fully endangered. In contrast, if you take the bull by the horns and you advance translocations and reintroductions, under federal and state law, you could build out a very accommodating management scheme to make sure that you were as respectful of the needs and concerns of your citizens as you possibly could be. You know, in the northern Rocky Mountains, you know what pushed the congressional delegations here over the top to support reintroductions? Was this notion that that northwestern naturally occurring population, northwestern Montana naturally occurring population was coming. It was coming as fully endangered. And they said, well, heaven's sakes, let's get the best deal for our neighbors that we can get. The best deal was through reintroductions, not waiting for the slow trickle of naturally occurring, fully endangered gray wolves to show up. State of Colorado's got a very good wolf management plan in place. It says great things like gray wolves are welcome wherever they don't cause problems, which is good because gray wolves don't read maps, so there's no real value in drawing a line on a map. It's a good plan, probably the most progressive plan in the Rocky Mountain West, put together by a varied stakeholder group. Great work. Offered it to the commission back in the day, this is the 1990s, on a consensus basis, completely premised on the notion of natural recolonization. Not a good deal. Not a good deal at all. Colorado provides tremendous opportunities to push the notion of wolf restoration forward. And in that regard, you could make the case that it is an archstone for nature, connecting or helping to create this meta-population of gray wolves from the high Arctic to the Mexican border. But I believe there's much more at play than that. Gray wolves, and you guys know this, serve as great symbols. A wolf project in Colorado might motivate people to rally on behalf of species that have no constituencies, species that have very bleak futures. One of the most pressing problems confronting humanity today is the extinction crisis. And when you think about that problem, be mindful, it's just the 6th time in the long history of multicellular life on this planet that we have been challenged by an extinction crisis. The last, and be mindful, I can make a case that multicellular life goes back 400 million years. They've had 5 crises before now. The 5th, the most recent one, was about 65 million years ago. I made reference to the asteroid striking the planet. Almost certainly ended the reign of the dinosaurs. The 6th crisis is of our making. And I would say to you, no matter who you are, this should matter. So let's assume for a moment that you're a person of faith. It would seem to me, if you love the Creator, you have to love the creation. And if you love something, how can you stand by and watch it needlessly destroyed without acting? Or, the flip side, you're a secular humanist, and you believe that above all else, it's facts and data and logic and empiricism that matter. Well, the best science tells us that it's the health of local landscapes that have always defined humanity's prospects. No matter who you are, the extinction crisis should matter. And I think wolf restoration says to us, we have the power to act as something other than misguided gods. And the recent past would suggest that's all we've been doing, acting as misguided gods. Wolf restoration would suggest we can choose to operate differently. And I would have you believe if we don't put our hands to work building these archstones, nature will have none.